You have said it. About someone you knew, someone you watched change. They used to be different. They used to be humble. They used to remember where they came from. And then the money came. And something shifted. Something you couldn't name at first, but you could feel. A distance, a coldness, a recalibration of what they found interesting and who they found worth their time. You watched it happen, and you told yourself you would never be like that. And here is the thing I need to tell you right now, before this video goes any further. You will be. Not because you are a bad person, not because wealth corrupts the weak while leaving the virtuous untouched, but because the psychological changes that money produces in human beings are not a matter of character. They are a matter of neuroscience, of social psychology, of cognitive rewiring that happens beneath the level of conscious choice. The money doesn't reveal who you really are. The money changes who you are. And tonight, we go inside exactly how it does that. In 2012, a research team at the University of California, Berkeley, led by psychologist Paul Piff, began publishing a series of studies that would become some of the most discussed and disputed findings in social psychology of the last 2 decades. Piff and his colleagues ran a simple but devastating series of experiments. In one, they observed pedestrian behavior at crosswalks. Drivers of expensive cars were 4 times more likely to cut off pedestrians than drivers of cheap cars. In another, they rigged a game of Monopoly to make one player richer than the other from the start, and found that the artificially advantaged player began showing measurable changes in behavior within minutes. They took more food from a shared bowl. They gestured more expansively. They spoke more loudly. They attributed their success to their skill rather than the rigged rules that produced it. In another study, participants were asked how much candy from a jar they would take, knowing the remainder would go to children. Wealthier participants took significantly more. Same candy jar, different wealth level, different moral behavior. Piff's conclusion was not that rich people are born bad. His conclusion was that wealth, the experience of having more, changes human psychology in consistent, measurable, and largely automatic ways. And the most disturbing finding was not what wealth does to people after years of accumulation. It was how quickly it begins. In some experiments, simply making people feel wealthy, asking them to compare themselves to people with less, giving them a small financial advantage in a game, produced measurable psychological changes within minutes. The money doesn't need years to change you. It begins immediately. What I'm about to show you are the 6 ways that money systematically changes human psychology, and why understanding them is not just intellectually interesting, but financially critical for anyone who is trying to build wealth without losing themselves in the process. Stay with me, because the 6th change is the one that makes all the others invisible to the person experiencing them. The first and perhaps most immediately disturbing change that wealth produces is a measurable reduction in empathy. This is not a philosophical observation. It is a neurological one. Research using fMRI brain imaging has shown that wealthier individuals show less neural activation in brain regions associated with compassion when observing others in distress. The brain's empathy circuitry, the mechanism that makes another person's pain register in your own nervous system, becomes less responsive as wealth increases. Why? Because empathy is fundamentally a resource-sharing mechanism. It evolved to make us feel the suffering of people close to us, so that we would be motivated to share our resources with them. An organism that felt nothing when its group members suffered would not share food, would not protect the vulnerable, would not invest in the social bonds that made group survival possible. But an organism with abundant resources faces a different calculation. When you have more than enough, The empathy mechanism that drives resource sharing becomes less necessary for your own survival. And what is less necessary becomes less active. This is why the research consistently shows that lower-income individuals donate a higher percentage of their income to charity than the wealthy. Not a higher absolute amount, a higher percentage. The person with less feels the pull of others' need more acutely, because their own experience of need is more proximate. Now consider what this means for someone building wealth. The gradual accumulation of financial security does not just change your material circumstances. It changes the sensitivity of the instrument through which you experience other people's reality. As the buffer between you and deprivation grows, the neural experience of deprivation in others, the empathic response that makes their situation feel urgent and real, quietly dims. You do not decide to care less. You do not choose to become more distant. The caring becomes less neurologically activated without your awareness or consent. And the most dangerous aspect of this change is that it is self-concealing. As empathy reduces, so does your awareness of the reduction. You don't feel yourself becoming less empathic. You simply begin to find other people's problems less immediately compelling, less emotionally involving, less real. The person you knew who changed after money, who became cold, who became distant, who stopped remembering where they came from, was not making a moral choice. Their brain was making a neurological adjustment, one that happens to everyone, at every wealth level, including the level you are trying to reach. The second change is one that almost every person who has watched someone get rich has witnessed, and almost no one can explain. It is the expansion of entitlement. Not the aggressive, obvious entitlement of someone demanding special treatment. The quiet, ambient entitlement that spreads through a person's behavior like a slow tide. The assumption that their time is more valuable than others. The expectation that exceptions will be made. The faint but consistent sense that the rules that apply to everyone else apply to them differently. Paul Piff's research captured this directly. In his monopoly experiment, the advantaged players not only took more food, they also exhibited what researchers described as entitlement behaviors. They moved their pieces more forcefully. They made decisions more quickly. They interrupted more frequently. They dominated the physical and conversational space of the game in ways that the disadvantaged players did not. None of them had been told to behave this way. The entitlement emerged spontaneously from the experience of advantage. Here is the psychological mechanism. When you have more resources, you interact with the world from a position of greater power. You have more options, more alternatives, more ability to absorb negative outcomes. In economic terms, you have leverage, and leverage changes behavior. When you have leverage, you don't need to accommodate. You don't need to wait. You don't need to be as careful about maintaining relationships because you have other options if a relationship fails. The behavioral flexibility that comes from having less, the patience, the accommodation, the careful management of how you are perceived, becomes less necessary. And what becomes less necessary becomes less practiced. And what becomes less practiced becomes less present in your character. The person who was once patient and humble was not pretending. They were genuinely patient and humble because their circumstances required it. When the circumstances change, the patience and humility that were grown in scarcity do not automatically survive in abundance. This is why the person you watched change after money seemed to forget the values they held when they had less. They didn't forget them. The conditions that produced those values no longer existed. And without the conditions, the values quietly eroded. The third change is the one that damages relationships most directly. As wealth increases, the social world recalibrates. Not through deliberate exclusion, but through a natural gravitational process that is almost impossible to resist. Your time becomes more valuable, or at least more demanded. The people who seek your company change. The conversations that feel relevant change. The problems that feel worth solving change. The social events you attend change. The reference points you use to evaluate your own situation change. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the social world you inhabited before the money begins to feel different. Not worse, necessarily, just different. Less immediately relevant to your current reality. Less connected to the problems and conversations that fill your days. This is not snobbery. It is not malice. It is social gravity. Wealthy people spend time with other wealthy people because they share contexts, references, problems, and opportunities. The same way that doctors spend time with other doctors and artists spend time with other artists. Not out of contempt for people outside their world, but because shared context makes connection easier and more immediately meaningful. But the consequence for the people left behind in the old social world is real and painful. The friend who used to be close becomes someone who is busy, who seems distracted when you talk, who has moved into a world whose problems and concerns are invisible from where you stand. They have not chosen to leave you. They have been recalibrated by their circumstances in a way that makes staying fully present in the old world increasingly difficult. Research by sociologist William Julius Wilson found that when individuals in lower-income communities achieved significant economic mobility, their rate of social connection with their original community dropped dramatically within 3 years. Not because they chose to disconnect, but because the structural conditions of their new economic position made maintaining those connections increasingly impractical. This is the social cost of the very mobility that financial advice columns celebrate. The wealth you build may cost you the world you built it in. The fourth change is the most intellectually interesting and the one with the most significant financial consequences. It is the attribution shift. The tendency, growing directly from the experience of wealth, to credit your own internal qualities for your financial outcomes and to minimize the role of external circumstances, luck, timing, and structural advantage. Piff's Monopoly experiment demonstrated this with almost comic clarity. When the advantaged player won, as they inevitably did given the rigged rules, and were asked why they had won, they consistently described their own strategy, their own decisions, their own skill. They did not say, "I won because I started with more money and rolled more dice." They said, "I won because I played well." The rules were rigged. The outcome was structurally determined. But the experience of winning produced an internal attribution, a sense that the win reflected something real and earned about the winner. This attribution shift has profound consequences for how wealthy people think about wealth itself. If you believe your wealth reflects your intelligence, your discipline, your work ethic, and your superior judgment, then wealth is a meritocratic outcome. It is deserved. It reflects the correct ordering of the world, and people who don't have it must correspondingly lack the qualities that produce it. This is not a position that wealthy people consciously arrive at through careful analysis. It is a position that wealth produces automatically through the attribution shift, and the financial consequences are significant. The attribution shift makes wealthy people resistant to information that challenges the narrative of deserved success. It makes them less likely to accurately evaluate when their outcomes reflect skill versus luck, a critical distinction in making sound future financial decisions. It makes them more confident than their actual track record warrants. And research on overconfidence in financial decision-making consistently shows that overconfidence is one of the single most reliable predictors of poor long-term financial outcomes. The money changes how you explain your success, and how you explain your success determines how you make your next decision. which determines whether the success continues. The fifth change is one that the financial industry depends on, and one that destroys more accumulated wealth than perhaps any other single factor. It is the recalibration of risk tolerance. When you have little, risk is visceral. The possibility of losing what you have is not an abstract financial concept. It is a felt threat to your immediate security. This visceral relationship with risk produces caution, deliberation, careful evaluation of downside before considering upside. But as wealth accumulates, risk changes its psychological character. The buffer between you and genuine deprivation grows. The consequences of losing become less immediately catastrophic, and risk begins to feel less threatening, more interesting, more like an opportunity than a danger. This recalibration is not entirely negative. Some increase in risk tolerance is appropriate and necessary for wealth building. The paralytic caution of scarcity is not a virtue in abundance. But the recalibration consistently goes further than is financially optimal. Research on investor behavior across wealth levels shows that high net worth individuals are not, as is commonly assumed, more sophisticated risk managers than ordinary investors. They are more confident risk takers, which is a fundamentally different thing. The wealthy investor who lost $100,000 in a bad trade has lost less than 1% of their portfolio. The visceral financial pain that would correct a poor decision in an ordinary investor is simply not present at sufficient intensity to produce the same correction. The wealthy can afford to be wrong more often. And the ability to afford being wrong makes them wrong more often. There is a second dimension to this change that is even more dangerous. As wealth accumulates and risk becomes less visceral, wealthy individuals increasingly seek out risk not for financial return, but for psychological stimulation. The thrill of the large bet, the excitement of the high-stakes negotiation, the dopamine of the gamble. These psychological rewards become available at a scale that ordinary financial life cannot produce, and they pull decision-making away from rational analysis towards sensation-seeking. This is why the stories of catastrophic wealth destruction, the inherited fortune lost in one generation, the self-made billionaire who bet everything on a single venture and lost, are not outliers. They are the predictable consequence of a risk recalibration that money itself produces in the people who accumulate it. The sixth change is the one that makes all the others permanent. It is the change in self-perception that makes the previous 5 changes invisible to the person experiencing them. Here is the mechanism. As wealth increases, the wealthy person's self-image, the story they tell themselves about who they are, does not automatically update to incorporate the psychological changes that wealth has produced. They still think of themselves as the person they were before the money. Empathic, humble, grounded, connected to where they came from. Because they still feel empathic, they still believe they are humble, they still feel connected. What they cannot perceive is that the instrument through which they measure these qualities has itself been recalibrated. They are measuring their empathy with a recalibrated empathy meter and concluding they still have as much empathy as before. They are measuring their humility with a recalibrated humility meter and concluding they are still humble. The measurement tool and the thing being measured have shifted together, making the shift invisible from the inside. This is why wealthy people so consistently and sincerely insist that money hasn't changed them. They are not lying. They are reporting accurately what their recalibrated self-perception tells them. The self-perception is simply no longer a reliable instrument. The person who says money hasn't changed them is like a person whose vision has slowly deteriorated over 20 years, insisting they can see perfectly because they can still read the largest line on the chart. They are comparing their current performance to their current standard, and both have declined together. And the financial consequence of this sixth change is the most serious of all. If you cannot perceive the ways that wealth is changing you, you cannot make decisions that account for those changes. You cannot notice when your empathy reduction is producing decisions that damage your relationships. You cannot notice when your entitlement expansion is generating resentment in people whose cooperation you need. You cannot notice when your attribution shift is making you overconfident in decisions that require more caution. You cannot notice when your risk recalibration is pulling you towards sensation-seeking rather than rational analysis. The sixth change is the one that locks all the others in place. It makes self-correction impossible because it makes the problem invisible. This is not a reason to stay poor. Let me be very clear about that. Understanding that wealth changes psychology is not an argument against building wealth. It is an argument for building wealth with conscious attention to the changes it is producing in you as it accumulates. The people who navigate wealth without losing themselves are not the ones who are immune to these changes. Nobody is immune. They are the ones who have built systems to compensate for changes they know are coming. They maintain deliberate relationships with people who knew them before the money and who will tell them the truth about what they observe. They build practices that deliberately counteract the empathy reduction. Regular, structured engagement with people whose circumstances are different from theirs. They establish rules for decision-making during periods of high confidence to protect against the attribution shift and the risk recalibration. They surround themselves with advisors whose financial incentive is to challenge their judgment rather than confirm it. They treat the psychological changes of wealth not as signs of corruption, but as predictable weather patterns that require preparation rather than surprise. The monk who says he is not tempted by money and the billionaire who says money has not changed him share the same error. They both believe they are exempt from forces that apply to everyone else. The person who navigates wealth successfully is the one who knows the forces apply to them and prepares accordingly. Think about the person you know who changed after money. You have been judging them with a framework that says their change was a choice, a moral failure, a decision to prioritize wealth over humanity. It wasn't. It was neurological. It was psychological. It was structural. It was the predictable output of forces that apply to every human being who accumulates resources. Forces that have been shaping human behavior since long before money existed. That doesn't make the consequences less real for the people around them. It doesn't make the damage to relationships less painful. It doesn't mean there is no responsibility involved. But it does mean that the question is not whether money will change you. It will. The only question is whether you will see it happening. Subscribe, because every video on this channel is about seeing the forces that shape your financial life before they shape you without your awareness. And leave a comment. Which of these 6 changes have you already seen in someone you know? And if you are honest with yourself, which ones have you already started to feel in yourself? Because if you have any money at all, the answer to the second question is not none.